Alright folks, 18.6 to 18.7, and this is going to be the adrenal and the pineal. So anyway, this is a little bit of anatomy here. You got your kidneys, and you have your suprarenal or adrenal glands on top. So another name for an adrenal gland is suprarenal, on top of the renals. So adrenal or suprarenal glands. This is a blown up picture of the adrenal gland. You can see that it has, well, first of all, it has a capsule. Secondly, you can see it has a cortex and a medulla. The medulla makes epinephrine and norepinephrine. The medulla is really just modified sympathetic postganglionic neurons. That's really what it is, and we talked about that during the autonomic nervous system. And the cortex there's 3 layers to the cortex, and it makes some glucocorticoids, and the famous glucocorticoid, I say famous, I don't know why I say that, glucocorticoid, most well-known, I don't even know if it's the most well-known. Let me just keep my mouth shut on that. A well-known glucocorticoid is cortisol, and it makes mineral corticoids. Mineral corticoids. A well-known, well, this is really one of the few. A very well-known mineral corticoid is aldosterone. It's called a mineral corticoid because it affects sodium. Cortisol is called a glucocorticoid because it affects glucose. And lastly is it makes androgens. The other layer, there's 3 layers. Androgens. All right. So we make cortisol, aldosterone, and testosterone in our adrenal cortex. Okay. And our adrenal medulla, of course, makes epinephrine and norepinephrine.
The organs of the endocrine system secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream to assist in the regulation of various body functions. The endocrine glands discussed here are the suprarenal glands. The paired suprarenal or adrenal glands are pyramid-shaped endocrine glands located on the superior pole of each kidney. These glands receive a rich blood supply from multiple arteries and are drained by a single suprarenal vein. The suprarenal glands are composed of an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The cortex synthesizes more than 25 steroid hormones, known collectively as corticosteroids. The cortex consists of 3 layers. The zona glomerulosa is the thin outer layer. Its cells synthesize mineralocorticoids, a group of hormones that help regulate electrolyte composition and concentration in body fluids. The principal mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, which helps regulate sodium and potassium ions in the blood and body fluids. The zona fasciculata is the thick middle layer of the cortex. It is composed of lipid-rich cells that secrete glucocorticoids. These hormones stimulate metabolism of lipids and proteins, help regulate glucose levels in the blood, and play a role in decreasing inflammation. The most common glucocorticoids are cortisol and corticosterone. The zona reticularis is the deepest layer of the cortex. Its cells are arranged in irregular cords and produce adrenal sex hormones, including weak androgens and small amounts of estrogens. The inner core or medulla of each suprarenal gland consists of large clusters of chromaffin cells. When stimulated by sympathetic neurons of the autonomic nervous system, the medulla secretes the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. As these hormones circulate, they initiate multiple systemic mechanisms that contribute to the body's fight or flight response.
Okay, so make sure you know those 3 layers of the cortex, the zona glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. And then make sure you know which hormones come from it. Make sure you know the mineral corticoids come from the glomerulosa, the glucocorticoids come from the fasciculata, and the androgens and small amounts of estrogens come from the reticularis. So make sure you know that. This is just telling you what we just said, what the movie just told you, where the adrenal cortex is divided into the 3 layers and what each layer secretes. All right. Now, I got to tell you this. ACTH, you're used to you're used to this. You're used to the hypothalamus secreting CRH, going to the anterior pituitary, which secretes ACTH, which goes to the adrenal cortex, which secretes cortisol, and you'd be correct. But does ACTH have an effect on aldosterone? And the answer is a little bit. But mainly, aldosterone is stimulated by this angiotensin II hormone. It's also stimulated humorally. Hyperkalemia, elevated blood calcium, that's hyperkalemia, or calcium, I'm sorry, potassium. Geez, I'm looking right at it. Hyperkalemia stimulates aldosterone secretion, and I'll tell you why in the urinary chapter. We talk a lot about this later. And hyponatremia. Hyponatremia is low blood sodium. Hyponatremia. So hyperkalemia or hyponatremia both lead to aldosterone secretion. And what aldosterone does is it tells your kidneys to urinate out potassium. That fixes your hyperkalemia. And it tells it to reabsorb sodium, and that fixes your hyponatremia. So mainly three things affect aldosterone secretion. And that is angiotensin II, we'll talk more about that, hyperkalemia, and hyponatremia. All right. You can see the fasciculata secretes glucocorticoids. And this is stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. All right, and you can see the androgens are secreted by the reticularis. Small amounts of estrogens too, and this is stimulated by ACTH as well. All right, now I'm going to play this video on the action of glucocorticoid hormones. When any steroid hormone binds its receptor, it makes it's usually a nuclear receptor, sometimes a cytoplasmic receptor, but either way it turns on DNA, if you'll recall. What the hormone receptor complex does, the hormone receptor complex binds to a hormone response element on the DNA. So this is DNA. It's a part of the DNA called the hormone response element. But we take these hormone response elements and we name them specifically to what specific hormone they are. So we're going to have a cortisol response element, so CRE, and we'll have other ones we'll talk about as well. So the hormone receptor complex binds the DNA as a transcription factor, and it binds this response element. All right, let's look at this now.
Glucocorticoid hormones are steroid hormones that influence nutrient metabolism. These hormones activate genes for proteins involved in processes such as the synthesis of glucose, the breakdown of proteins, and the mobilization of fat. Glucocorticoid hormones are secreted by endocrine glands into the bloodstream. They enter cells through transporters in the plasma membrane. Once inside the cytosol, the hormone molecules can bind to glucocorticoid receptors, which function as transcription factors that activate genes. The binding of the hormone causes proteins that were bound to the receptor, such as the heat shock protein HSP90, to be released. Release of HSP90 allows two receptors to bind and form a dimer, as well as exposing a nuclear localization signal on the receptor. The receptor dimer is then allowed to enter into the nucleus through a nuclear pore. The receptor dimer is able to bind to specific DNA sequence regions called glucocorticoid response elements, or GREs, that are near target genes. The GREs function as enhancers, so that binding of a receptor dimer to a GRE activates transcription of the nearby target gene.
Okay, so that's how a steroid hormone activates a gene. And they all have similar actions. I mean, obviously their receptor is slightly different because these steroid hormones have slightly different structures. I mean, they have the cyclopentanoephenanthrene ring, but they have different side groups. But they're all going to be eerily similar, and that is they're going to turn on genes. That's what they're going to do. So that's cortisol.
Aldosterone is a lipid-soluble hormone that can easily diffuse through the plasma membrane. Inside the cell, aldosterone binds with an aldosterone receptor molecule in the cytoplasm. The aldosterone receptor complex moves into the nucleus and binds to DNA. The binding of the aldosterone receptor complex to DNA stimulates the synthesis of messenger RNA, which codes for specific proteins. The messenger RNA moves from the nucleus into the cytoplasm and binds to ribosomes, where it directs the synthesis of specific proteins. These proteins produce the response of the cell to aldosterone.
Okay, and that response, if this is a renal cell, and it typically is a renal cell, that response is going to be the reabsorption of sodium with the concomitant secretion of potassium. That means potassium is going to be urinated out. So you can fix hyponatremia by this aldosterone turning on the gene. You can fix hyperkalemia and some blood pressure issues we'll talk about later. Okay. Now, the adrenal medulla makes epinephrine, and epinephrine is a water-soluble, hydrophilic, lipophobic hormone that does not enter the cell. So let's look at that.
Epinephrine is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of cAMP from ATP. The cAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose. Through this multi-step mechanism, epinephrine causes the liver to secrete glucose into the blood during the fight or flight reaction.
All right, so that's epinephrine, and it's a G protein mediated hormone. And it's showing you that it tells the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose. So epinephrine leads to glucose mobilization. Now, another hormone does that. Another hormone called glucagon also turns on phosphorylase and causes the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. So glucose is released to the bloodstream. These are synergistic to each other. So we talked about PTH and calcitonin being antagonistic. Now I'm telling you that epinephrine and glucagon are synergistic. They enhance each other's effect. All right, so we've looked at permissive hormones, that's T3 and T4. We've looked at antagonistic hormones, PTH and calcitonin, and we looked at synergistic hormones, glucagon and epinephrine. All right, the pineal gland. You guys know where the pineal gland is because you've studied the brain already. So what the pineal gland is sits back here above the superior colliculi. Has a little habenula coming off of it. I don't see the habenula here. I'll erase my circle and see if I can see it. I just don't see the habenula. No, I don't see it. You got the fornix right. Let me just do some anatomy for you so you can see. You got the fornix right here. You got the corpus callosum right here. You have the septum pellucidum right here. You have the thalamus right here with the interthalamic adhesion right here. You have the hypothalamus right here, and you have the pineal gland right there. All right, so that's some anatomy just to remind you. Now, what does the pineal gland do? Well, it's the pinealocytes, some people call them. Some people call it the pineal gland, and that's fine. What the pineal gland does, and the pinealocytes in there, they produce this hormone called melatonin. What melatonin is involved is your sleep-wake cycles, your circadian rhythms. It's involved in that, and melatonin affects your reticular activating system. Another thing it does, and this is pretty cool, is it delays the onset of puberty. Or I don't know if the word delay, that's probably not a good word. It helps to regulate the onset of puberty. So this is what melatonin is involved in the onset of puberty, or in this case, it regulates it. A lot of people take melatonin for sleep reasons, and you got to be careful because melatonin has a reproductive effect as well. So I guess it depends on your age and everything when you're taking the melatonin. I certainly think you ought to be careful and talk to your doctor because melatonin is a hormone, and it's not like you go out there and just prescribe yourself birth control pills because that's a hormone. You would talk to your doctor first. You probably should talk to your doctor before dealing with melatonin. All right, folks, that's the end of 18.6 and 18.7.